So today's reading is from Mark, chapter 6, starting at verse 14, and then we'll read through to verse 29, and that can be found on page 1008 of the Pew Bibles. It's entitled, John the Baptist Beheaded. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. Some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said, he is Elijah. And still others claimed, he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had bound and put him in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she wasn't able to, because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Finally, the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. The king said to the girl, ask me for anything you want, and I'll give it to you. And he promised her with an oath, whatever you ask, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what shall I ask for? The head of John the Baptist, she answered. At once the girl hurried into the king with the request, I want you to give me right now the head of John the Baptist on a dish. The king was greatly distressed, but because of his oath and his dinner guests, he didn't want to refuse her. So he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a dish. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you so much. Thank you. May I speak in Jesus' name? Amen. I think you probably all know what I mean by a flashback. You know, when you're watching a film, very often in films, the producers will suddenly interrupt the story that they're telling us to show us a different scene, something which happened weeks, days, months before. And they do that because that's some information we need to understand in order to make full sense of the main story they're telling us. And sometimes that main story and the flashback, when they're seen together, tell us more about what is going on. I think that's why film producers do it. Sometimes I find them very helpful, sometimes I find them really confusing, but that's just me. But I mention that because that reading we've just heard from Mark, read so nicely, thank you so much, about Herod's brutal murder of John the Baptist, is a flashback. Mark interrupts his story of the gospel, his story about Jesus, to tell us something very, very different that happened earlier. And he wants us to read both these stories together so that we can understand each of them a bit better. Unfortunately, the lectionary today just gives us the flashback, not the rest of the story. So it's worth just recapping for a minute what's going on. Immediately before this passage, Jesus is traveling around teaching and healing people and casting out evil spirits and so on. And he goes to his hometown of Nazareth, his hometown. And he meets old friends, he meets people he's known when he was growing up. And he goes to the local synagogue to teach. But when he does, the people there reject him. In fact, Mark says to us that they take offense at Jesus. They perhaps can't understand why this young man they saw grow up in their midst is now professing such wisdom and knowledge. Maybe he doesn't quite fit the image that they have of him when he comes. But nevertheless, they take offense. But Jesus shows no resentment. I'm sure he forgives them. But he's not discouraged. He doesn't just walk off. He carries on curing some people who need him, and then he leaves the town. And Mark makes a note that he is amazed at their unbelief. And then Jesus and his disciples tour around the countryside, continuing their work, until Jesus decides to send them off in twos to travel around the countryside on their own, to continue his ministry in his name. They're to follow his example, take only essential possessions with them, exactly as Jesus does, and he gives them power to heal and expel unclean spirits. And he says that if anywhere you go rejects you, does not welcome you, move on. Simply kick the dust of their town from your shoes and move on. Exactly as he did when he left Nazareth, because he was rejected there. And then later, when the disciples return from their mission, they tell Jesus all they've done in his name, but they're tired. They need rest. They need quiet. But they're followed by a big crowd, and that crowd won't leave them alone. There are people who want to hear Jesus teach. There are people who hope to be cured. And the disciples and Jesus get absolutely no rest at all. And it gets late, and the people get hungry. Jesus and his disciples and all the others get hungry. And the scene is set for the feeding of the 5,000 with 5 loaves, 2 fish, with 12 baskets of leftovers, if you remember the story. And that's that picture there. That's a picture from the Methodist Fine Art Collection, which I think is rather lovely. It's always there, they're all sitting around eating fish and chips. They're all having a feast on the hillside. Excuse me a second. Mark inserts his story of Jesus, of Herod executing John the Baptist, in between those two stories. Herod hears about all the good work that the disciples and Jesus are doing, and he wants to know, he and other people want to know exactly who are these people, where are their powers coming from, what is it they're doing. Some people think that it must be a prophet, it may be Elijah, who's good doing all this good work. But as soon as Herod hears what's happening, he knows immediately that it's John the Baptist. It's the man that he executed. And at that point, Mark inserts his flashback. I couldn't find a good graphic for a flashback, so I've used the picture of a diary. There are some flashback images on the internet, but they're not at all appropriate, so I use this one. And then Mark tells the story of how it is that Herod came to execute John the Baptist in between these other two stories. The story is awful at every stage, as we heard. Herod is holding a birthday banquet for a lot of his friends and a lot of his people. But it is an awful story. Herod stupidly offers his daughter-in-law anything she wants, just to dance in front of his guests and to titivate them. And Herod's wife, Herodias, holds a raging spite against John the Baptist because he criticized her marriage to Herod. And when Herod invites her daughter to dance for the people, she sees an opportunity. And she says to her daughter, "Ask Herod for the head of John the Baptist." And Herod shamelessly and cruelly agrees to what she wants. He's publicly offered her anything she wants. It's very hard for him to back down now. When she asks for the head of John the Baptist, he says, "All right, you can have it." And when the deed is done, he parades John the Baptist's head through the banqueting hall on a plate and presents it to his daughter-in-law. This is a painting of that moment. It's a pretty horrific painting. It's by Caravaggio. It's in the National Gallery. It shows John the Baptist's head on a plate, and I assume that maybe is the executioner. And there's his daughter-in-law, who is the dancer, looking over her shoulder, wondering, what on earth have I done? What did I ask for? And what has been done now in my name? And looking over her shoulder, gloating at John the Baptist, is Herodias, her mother, who asked for it to be done. It's generally a pretty awful scene, an awful story. But I think the point is this: all that really matters to Herod is his reputation with Rome for being a strong ruler. That's his job. And that reputation depends on complete domination of everyone around him. And for Herod, domination means that everyone must fear him. And that fear is deepened when, in front of all his guests, he orders the murder of a good man just to gratify his wife, perhaps as casually as he might buy her a new handbag. And Herod's action here is especially craven because, as Mark tells us, he actually liked John. He liked to listen to John. John's teaching unsettled Herod. And Herod recognizes John as a righteous and a holy man. And up to this point, Herod's protected John the Baptist. But any respect Herod has for John evaporates as soon as John's death is useful to him. That's finally how much worth a man's life is to Herod. But there is some light at the end of this dark story. You might have caught that last sentence in the reading from Mark. John's disciples hear about his murder and they come and ask for his body, take it away and lay it in a tomb. And that shows enormous courage, I think. It's a very risky thing to do. To go to the man who's murdered your best friend and ask for his body back might well land you in a lot of trouble. It shows great devotion to the man they loved. And you might also remember, perhaps, at the very end of Mark's Gospel, right, the other end of his book, Joseph of Arimathea shows the same courage to ask Pilate for Jesus' crucified body, and to give Jesus a proper burial. At the end of both of these stories of darkness and sadness, there are those moments of light. The courage of John's disciples reminds me, and I think other people as well, of the funeral of Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident. I won't speculate about how he died on the 16th of February this year, but his family buried him in a Moscow cemetery on the 1st of March. And they were accompanied by the biggest opposition gatherings in Russia for 3 years, in a very public and a very defiant display of affection and respect for a man destroyed by a ruthless dictator. And that too was faced enormous risk, called for real courage by many people. And that perhaps was also, I'm sure, a light at the end of a really awful story. I wish that awful story was over. But for that episode, it was a sign of light and courage. And I think one of the things that Mark is telling us here is that it is not always possible to control the destructive power of a ruthless leader, people who are deaf to the truth. But innocent people suffer. And the story of John's murder by Herod, I think, asks a question. He asks, what does faithful, active resistance to injustice and destructive power look like? And do I have the courage to act like those thousands of people who came out for Alexei Navalny? And I think Mark's story about Herod asks us all that question. It's a question at the very heart of what it sometimes means to be Christian. So Mark gives us two stories to be read side by side, so we might understand them both better. There's the violent and dark story of Herod and John the Baptist, and that is bracketed by the story of Jesus and his disciples, devoting their lives to spreading the gospel of Christ, transforming darkness into life in people's lives. Mark writes about two powers. There's Herod's power based on fear, and there's God's power based on the love disclosed to us through Jesus Christ. And Mark writes about two banquets, one enclosed in darkness and horror, and the other on an open hillside without a guest list, where everyone is welcome and where even the leftovers are beyond measure. And he writes of two understandings of truth. There's Herod's conviction that truth is whatever is best for him personally. And there's Jesus' teaching that the truth is faith and trust in the one true God. Two stories, side by side, one full of darkness and fear, and the other full of lightness and joy. And the flashback that Mark puts in about Herod is exactly that. It is in the past. No matter what Herod does, God's work through Jesus and his disciples continues without interruption, transforming darkness into light. And John and Jesus were friends. Their ministries were close. And I think John's death must have hurt and angered Jesus very deeply. But his ministry continues without a pause, because he knows that in the end, God's light will triumph over the darkness of evil. And Mark's message is that same to us as well. Mark knows that throughout life we meet both the light of Christ and the darkness of evil. He wrote his gospel probably in Rome around 70 AD, about the same time as Rome destroyed the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Now that temple was the very centre of the Jewish world, and its destruction was most awful disaster for the Jews. Mark is writing for the young Christian church in Rome, which was fighting for its existence against Roman opposition and Jewish opposition. And the destruction of the temple would have caused them deep upset and pain and grief and worry, a lot of stress. Mark's message to them, and to us today, is that no matter how impenetrable the darkness might seem, the light of Christ will always overcome it. With faith and prayer, there is no sadness and pain that Christ cannot transform into peace and joy, even the sadness and pain of living under a despot like Herod. Remember this when the world looks to us gloomy and depressing, when the work we want to do for Christ here on earth in our lifetimes is frustrated and difficult, because God has a plan and God intends to finish it. That is Mark's message for the church in his lifetime, and it's his message for us too today. One last thought. There have been many Herods in the world since Mark wrote. Maybe there are some Herods living in the world today. And some of them actively persecute Christians and stop the gospel of Christ being heard. And they try to swamp the light of Christ with their own variety of darkness. One of the saddest aspects of Christianity today, I think, is the persecution of Christians because of their faith. You know, it's estimated that worldwide maybe 1 in 7 Christians face some kind of persecution, some kind of discrimination. That's about 360 to 370 million Christians facing some kind of persecution. That's more than the population of the United States. At its worst, that persecution is merciless. Last year it's estimated about 5,000 Christians were murdered for their faith, and about 4,000 were abducted. And maybe 15,000 Christian premises and buildings were attacked. Some of these people and their communities live in fear for themselves and their families, but their faith in Christ is too strong to be ground down. There is a charity you might know of called Open Doors, and it monitors and reports on the persecution of Christians around the world. There are similar charities which also report on the same topics. If you don't know it, do please look it up on the internet. Read some of the stories there about families dispossessed and condemned to poverty because a Bible has been discovered buried underground. About where Christians bury Bibles in the forest so they can go there and meet and read and pray in their hope in secret. These are people persecuted every day and people executed for professing their Christian faith. And those people live with Herod every day. Every day they proclaim the truth of the gospel of Christ in their own lives. Please pray for them. In Jesus' name, amen.